Well met, vislae. As always, I'm Jordan from Sortilege here, and we're going to go through Season 2's Un Coup de Da, my Invisible Sun campaign. We've just kicked this off in the past week, and I'll be doing a campaign log after each group session, kind of catching people up and providing a little bit of a summary and also a little bit of ways for people to get a sense as to how these campaigns are constructed, what the difference is between what is prepared and what actually happens, etc. So this is a continuation of my existing Invisible Sun campaign. We had a couple players bow out, a couple new players added. We did do a new session 0 with the old and the new players to flesh out the new players' characters and to basically make sure that everybody's on the same page with what's going on. So I'm going to talk. We'll introduce the characters and a little bit of what happened last time. In fact, I'll read a little poem that I put together as a season 1 summary. This is my sad attempt at rap. I'm not going to attempt to rap it, but it's to the tune of Yankee the Brave by Run the Jewels. So our summary from last season, we have Ward, bald answer, timid ghostmancer, ephemera enhancer. Inner voice wants to lay down, get down, don't matter. Yes, ma'am, I'm a yes man. Of course I'll host her. More doormat than door, make my shrink sadder. Jeremiah. My path was short but succinct, flowing hard with the drinks. My ballroom's the best gig in town, don't you think? Stayed in the parade, despite the mafia shakedown. Found strung to the ceiling in an implausible breakdown. Winstead. Wrong sipping, now the nose dripping, head splitting, corpse of flower bed, but suddenly I'm back up kicking. Street swerve, unnerved, the curve left the burb. Minesweepers for those who'd rather die than serve. Ward. Rhea couch crashes in a pad that's paid for in script from the not a cult handing out mail delivery trips. Piggybacking on the press gang that sent us out to the gulch, where I was popped by the puff caps, left corporeal mulch. Marweg. Mess with me at Aegeus, my lady will call you out. Filled my bestiary with observations from our nightside route. Read the fine print, found out how Stamwent's castled the rook. Tea time lead on the Goetic and the mage coins he took. Winstead again. Fell shadows and novellas chthonic, a crime and a punishment with consequences demonic. Sold the cursed soul to a bloodthirsty warden, bumped into a war buddy in the unruly garden. Rhea. Paths have been walked by vislae and borrow. Past love's reunions bring both joy and sorrow. Currents revealed as secrets found traitors by ley line kaleido cathedral invaders. Kithri. Pristine EMT, Terry nodded a fire. Sky Tower, tried to stress the situation was dire. Stumbled onto the Godfather, Maxwell, Corleone. Pursued leads and dipped out, absentee chaperone. Ward. Even the spare burned out, but with him went the cyst. My sponsor stole my work, and I deferred to enlist. 2nd degree, and soon 3, with vest for the assist, beholden to the king of ghosts, whom Pale banished. Rhea. The high is incidental, the income is primary. Better the leaves than a mere ossuary. Was kicked off the couch, but I sent the mail elsewhere, assisting the acolyte under the chair's stare. Marweg. Backdoor to blue, found the push me pull you, with a purview, expanding now renward and stam. Cut of angel or lamb, I fulfill each rite pragmatically, and navigate the order's ossified bureaucracy. So that was maybe not a full explanation, but it gives you a little bit of a taste as to what the last year's worth of play involved. And we'll go into detail as to what some of those more meaningful elements were. And I'll also include a link to the full poem for your reference. And so the players that we have continuing with us are, we have Marweg. Marweg is a established perceptive, i.e. empath, Goetic, who converses with everything. He's currently a 2nd degree Goetic. We have Ward. Ward is a stalwart, enthusiastic, or ardent maker who heralds plagues. He's now a second-degree maker. He was previously had the forte, provides a vessel for spirits, but after he died, and he's currently still a ghost, we had him take on the Heralds Plagues forte, and we'll get to that. Rhea is an itinerant empath weaver who walks the path of suns. She's a second-degree weaver. And then our new characters, we have two. We have Lumina, who's an iconoclastic, mischievous weaver who shepherds minds. And we have Hatta, an established empath who revels in beauty. So we spent a little bit of time in the session 0, getting to know Lumina, getting to know Hatta, building out some basic structures for them to play within. And we came up with some interesting ideas, my favorite of which is the bicycle gang in Hatta's neighborhood that works kind of like jury duty, where you just get a little postcard saying that you're going to be a part of the bicycle gang for a bit, and you have to serve or there's some sort of consequence. And it's not a nice gang. They do unpleasant things sometimes, and the association we kind of had was the idea of like the Briar King, where you have somebody who gets a kind of formal designation as someone who's supposed to play tricks and cause problems. And there's almost a little bit of a trickster deity association. And even after that designation then moves to somebody else, like on the one hand, you were doing those things as a gang member, as the Briar King, but it was also kind of you that did it, and people do, that shadow does kind of linger a little bit. So I look forward to using that. We also had a really fun idea of a contractor who was a little bit down on his luck because every so often one of his jobs returns to him. So a whole bunch of drywall or paint just kind of makes its way back to his front yard, and much to his chagrin. We also had a little bit of a wrapping up of things from the last campaign, from the last season. And one of the side sessions that we did in between then and now was Rhea in particular. Now, Rhea had been an emotion leaf dealer. And emotion leaves, think of it a little bit like marijuana. There aren't laws against drugs in Satyrine, but emotion leaves are a little different in that the emotion leaf consortium holds a de facto monopoly, and they enforce that with prejudice. So non-emotion mill consortium emotion leaves are a black market substance, and Rhea has been a dealer in that for some time. She brought some back from Nightside Blue. I believe it was Nightside Blue. And she currently has that in her new home in the cathedral. Now, this abandoned cathedral is the same place where she met Aberrincula and learned how to walk different paths. She learned the Path of Zane from Aberrincula. She learned the Pathwalker spell from Aberrincula, and later learned that Aberrincula was the fallen Goetic, formerly known as Asclepius, who was responsible for basically taking the money and then voiding the contract with the Stamwent's parade. And we'll touch more on that when that's appropriate. But suffice to say, Aberrincula has been out of town for a while, and Rhea's very interested in catching up now that she knows a little bit more about his past. But she's in this empty cathedral. She's now found the deed to it, and now owns it outright. She's growing her emotion leaves there a little bit, but she's looking at getting out of that business because her ex-lover from Shadow, who she ran into in the Nightside Blue last year, or in the last season, turns out he's back in Satyrine and has asked for her help with some things. And it turns out that both of his parents are on the board of directors for the Emotion Mills Consortium. So she's said yes, but she's also gone to gone to her supplier to basically break the news that she doesn't really want to be selling emotion leaves and also working for the consortium. And she just feels like that's going to blow back badly in her face. And Aesop, her supplier, agreed, thought that was great. He mentioned that he thought that the emotion leaves as a market were kind of declining, and he recommended that they switch over to selling these shards, these little mirror shards, and told her that he would send her kind of like a sample pack. And so she asked for him to send that sample pack to Sister Mortheg's halfway home for semi-departed spirits. And that's the old neighbor that she and Ward used to have. Now, she used to live with Ward at Ward's apartment. But Ward's apartment, Ward used to be a devotee of the Cathedral of Illuminism. And we've kind of talked about them as being reverse Scientologists, where their idea is that we want people to host spirits, that every spirit should have a body. And if there's more spirits than bodies, then let's add multiple spirits per body. So Ward, with his provides a vessel for spirits forte, was very much in high demand and was rapidly rising in the Cathedral of Illuminism, and had a church-provided apartment that Rhea, who was homeless and itinerant, had been kind of sleeping on the couch and living there in the near term. And that apartment was next to this halfway house. But when Ward died, the cathedral didn't disavow him, but they recommended steering him towards a kind of remedial training to work back to getting a body. But in the meantime was useless to them as a host. And so they voided his rental agreement for this apartment and are making it available to another cathedral acolyte. So they were suddenly homeless. So they've actually both moved into this abandoned cathedral, an actual architectural cathedral, not an organization, called Cathedral, that Rhea's discovered was a former temple associated with the Kaleidoscope Void, and she doesn't quite know what that is. She's also had to, she's changed the locks a little bit. There's been a number of acolytes from some other religious sect who have been coming by and checking out the place and trying to get in. So she's not quite sure what the deal is with that. So when I was prepping for this was the first session with the new characters and the 3 old characters. So I had these 5 characters, and they don't have any. I'm trying to be a little bit more open world with this. I have a whole bunch of major plot things that are going to be going on around these characters, but it's kind of an open question to me as to whether or not they touch on any of them directly. These are things that are going to be happening around them that are going to be transforming what they're interacting with, what they're doing. But I'm open to anything from they end up becoming the centerpiece of these actions to this is all just background and they're having their own little drama that's completely it's informed by but is separate from these bigger movements. So as a result, I wanted to have a very light touch and not just thrust people into a mission. I wanted to give them an opportunity to figure out what directions they wanted to go and what should happen. So I came up with 3 starting scenes, and I had a few other ideas for things that we could riff off of, but the 3 scenes I figured would at least take us most of the way through the night and would give me some ideas as to what to lead into from there. So the 3 scenes were having Rhea and possibly Ward go to Sister Mortheg's halfway home for semi-departed spirits and pick up the bag that Aesop left for her. So that was the first scene. And that's just a little bit of just reintroducing NPCs from last time and walking that through. Then the second scene was Hatta wanted to be like a barista of sorts. And so there had been mention of a cafe from last time that we never really did anything with. So I made it that same cafe. And there had been talks about the meeting place where Rhea and Ward would read the newspaper with a little group. I just made it the same place. And then Lumina, the new character, talked about having like these stitch and bitch sessions with the rest of her coven of other weavers. And so I just said, let's just collide that all into the same place. We'll have them all meet up. It's like the weekly newspaper meeting. It's the month-end coven meeting. And it's all at the cafe that Hatta works at. And so that would give me 4 out of the 5 characters in one place to do things with. And then the final one was at a cafe in the Undersling. Now, when they returned from the main arc last time was a geas that the Minister of Public Works, Ogfalan, had laid upon Ward, Rhea, and Marweg. And so they ended up traveling all the way to Nightside Green and back. They dealt with a hate cyst in Fartown in a neighborhood called Gatesmith. Having destroyed the hate cyst, they got the reward. The geas was lifted, and Gatesmith became habitable again. And there was an absolute land rush for it. And so right now there's been a ton of construction there. There's been a lot of things happening. But upon return as well, Marweg had been strongly encouraged to resume his studies and progress towards 2nd degree as a Goetic. And he was paired with a mentor named Vincent, who lived in the Undersling. And this was actually from a game that I was a player in. And I had come up with a house with 4 housemates for my character in the Undersling, and a bar that my character worked at called Obliteration. So I just took those from that other game and brought them into this game. So he's been learning from Vincent, and so I set it up where Vincent and the other housemates there would bring bring Marweg over to Obliteration. They would have a drink. The idea being that we could, potentially lure a couple others there. Hatta in particular had talked about that he had a friend who was this gaseous cloud being who was a bouncer in the Undersling at some sort of bar, and that Hatta wants to learn how to make more powerfully emotional drinks and things like that. And so I just said, hey, your character is a bouncer at Obliteration. And so we have Hatta, we have Marweg, we potentially have Ward, because there is another ghost maker that lives with Vincent as a renter, and Ward was introduced to him at the end of the last season. So that's potentially 3. And I'm like, so between these 3 scenes, I have several semi-overlapping groups of people, and we can see what happens with them. So let's talk about what happened. So Rhea and Ward both have decided to come over to Sister Mortheg's, and Rhea had actually been inside before, but Ward hadn't. And so Rhea comes in. Sister Mortheg is this snake woman, kind of like a Naga nun or something. She's really sweet. The house is very sparse, very small, modest setups. There's a long table, but there's only a couple placement settings. And that's because it's basically Sister Mortheg and Marty, who was an NPC that she tolerates and that Ward and Rhea had some humorous interactions with previously. Marty is really well-intentioned, but thinks he's dead and isn't. And that causes complications. But Rhea sits down. She's gossiping with Sister Mortheg. Ward, who's a ghost, this is the first time he's ever been inside, and this is the first time that he's been to Sister Mortheg's since returning from the Nightside Green, where he died. And he sees all the other occupants, and there's dozens of these ghosts and spirits who are in various stages of maturation. And he sees like etheric artworks and furniture and just all kinds of things. And he actually doesn't even realize that Marty's talking to him right away, because he's just so overwhelmed. People are greeting him, and it's a little bit of an overload for him. Marty gets talking about how he's having visa troubles. He's been trying to go to the Pale, which is where all the dead go. And I have a lot of long-term plans for the Pale, so I've been trying to drop some hints about things. And so Marty was basically saying how there's some sort of backlog, and Sister Mortheg is also complaining about this to Rhea, that all kinds of, it's not like people are dying faster, but they're transitioning to the pale more slowly. And so it's caused a lot of complications for her. Now, Ward, at the end of the previous season, took on a new patron. And this patron is Mischievous, who is also known as the Ghost King. And Mischievous has an objective, which is that ghosts do not go to the pale. He doesn't want that. And so Ward is starting to, take on some of those ideas and beliefs. And so he spends a little bit of time, badly convincing Marty that, the pale's not all that it's cracked up to be. And, maybe there's some other issues. Marty isn't so much convinced as intrigued, in large part because he's never heard of the Ghost King before. Marty also hasn't realized that Ward is dead yet, because Ward's able, he's there's different levels of ghost, and Ward's high enough level as a ghost that he's able to present physically to a degree, audibly to a degree, things like that, mostly just for short periods of time. And, at this point we pulled the Silver Sun, we pulled the Watcher card, which, the Watcher card we have, it's the Sovereign of Mysteries. And it talks about like paying close attention. It's kind of a father figure that shares knowledge, etc. I won't go through all of them, but I'll kind of mention them in passing as I go, and particularly where they got leaned on heavily. So yeah, as a result of that, Rhea has the idea of, let's maybe check out the Pale Embassy in the Marquis Quarter, which is a great idea. Was not one I was prepared for at all. So I basically noted in my mind that if they decide to do that, I will punt to have that be a side session or next time, because I didn't actually know what would happen there. And then, Sister Morthag gave Rhea the shards that Aesop had put aside for her. And this is kind of vaguely understood, but when they were leaving Nightside Blue in the last season, we jokingly, they were in this area where there's all these butchered reflections, basically. And eventually, I think Rhea's going to put two and two together that the quote-unquote meth lab that they escaped from is, in fact, the production house for the mirror shards that she's going to start peddling, and, make of that what she will. So it's also unclear, like, what their actual effects are and all that kind of things. So then we cut scenes over to Deja Brew, which is, we're all for terrible puns. Hatta lives right above the cafe. And so, we kind of set up a little bit of a process by which, Hatta wakes up, walks downstairs, is smelling the baking, and meets his landlord and proprietor, Jameer, who, in my head, I have as, I forget the actor's name, but Mother's Milk from The Boys, just this, this gruff sweetheart, basically, who's always stressed, and in this case is, trying to get the last fucking batch of goddamn macaroons pulled together. This is, again, this was a nameless NPC that we had come up with in the first session 0 over a year ago, of this baker who wanted to do this like really crazy fancy artisanal things, and is basically stuck just making standard sheet cakes and things like that. So that's kind of the running joke, is that, Hatta is aspiring to do the things that Jameer has basically resented the fact that he can't, or for whatever reason. So that'll be an interesting dynamic to play off of. But yeah, the cafe itself is kind of spacious. Hatta added a secret, which was that it has a singing fireplace. So he put that in the cafe itself, and so as they start things off, you can put, basically put music on in the fireplace. And then in the normal books, they basically say that the calendar systems all work the same as normal, but I actually came up with a custom calendar system for my actuality. And so this is the last day of the week of the month of Annis, and the day of the week is Fjaldan. And so the Coven of Wittershinks, which is Lumina's weaver cell, is having their end of month get together. And then the Obverse Herald reading group is having their weekly get together. The Obverse Herald is a Fartown weekly paper where this came up in the initial session 0, where this weekly paper gives headlines that are the opposite of true. And sometimes they are also a little bit ahead of time. They might be telling the future headline, but the opposite. And the point of the reading group is figuring out in what way is it opposite, because it's not always clear. So there's some interpretive element to it. So a couple other, we didn't really lean on this too much, but next to the cafe is basically like a fraternity, which is mixed gender fraternity, called Gevera House, which is associated with the Vancian University, and we'll be leaning on that a little bit more in the future. The Coven is definitely skews older, and the sort of like cheerful lesbian aunt prototype that they had previously be a member of the Obverse Herald reading group, we decided we're also members of the Coven. So there's a little bit of a link there, some crosstalk. And yeah, Lumina is one of maybe 3 of the younger crowd there. They're, crocheting and knitting and, doing kind of crafts and things like that. And Rhea and Ward are unfashionably late. They arrive after everyone's pretty much done. Ward arrives as a person, and then as he gets into the paper, he starts to fade out. And Hatta recognizes them as the regulars that they are, but maybe doesn't know them super closely. So the headlines that I gave for the paper, these are always like far trickier to write than I think. The Vancian University board passes budget for new college. So that to me is a really simple one that I don't have any big ideas behind. Bullish emotion leaf market is an allusion to some of the stuff that Rhea was seeing, which is that that market is crashing for various reasons. Construction boom in Gatesmith continues apace. Well, they've known that construction's been going on in Gatesmith, so the fact that this is what they know to be true is what the headline is saying implies that it's no longer true, or that they're misunderstanding something. So that was a play there. Yakuto has returned to Saturnine. So with that one, I'll come back to that one in a minute. Death of Minister of Internal Affairs. They had a funeral, and the Minister of Defense and Justice has taken responsibility for both departments. So again, they basically are talking about like, well, what's the opposite of death? Was somebody born? Is there a pregnancy? Was the department eliminated? Was there an appointment? Are stoic twigs booming? And then Ward has heard of Yakuto. Yakuto was a charismatic Vance who taught at the university part-time, but went to other sons, did a lot of hands-on research, was eligible for some of the highest offices at the Vancian University, and wasn't so much kicked out as basically encouraged to take an indefinite sabbatical. So, Yakuto is definitely going to come back in as part of that background that they may or may not engage with directly, but will be definitely making waves that they'll have to deal with. So Ward was thinking, maybe he was here in secret, then left again, or Rhea was thinking maybe he got stuck. Now, emotion leaves are kind of outside of Deja Brew's price point, so they use cheaper substitutes. Hatta's definitely interested in that, because if they're suddenly cheaper, then he could be getting, making some higher quality drinks and things like that. And he kind of gets picks up on the fact that Rhea knows something about this, and they agree to meet later, at some point. Hatta then sees that his friend, the gaseous cloud, is actually outside and goes over to greet him. Someone is leafleting on the steps of the cafe, passing out flyers that say, "I promise not to sleep." And when Hatta kind of engages them, they say how they've already made the pact. I encourage you to make it as well. Together, we can defeat sleep's tyranny. Not only are those invaluable hours stolen from you, but so also is the feeling of loss stolen. And Hatta basically is like, yeah, that's nice. Can I interest you in a drink? Whatever. His friend Aphis was kind of prepared to deal with the situation, but then Aphis invites Hatta to come by Obliteration, where they're having a guest bartender that Hatta could potentially learn from. So then with all that, when Hatta and Rhea talk, Hatta does not want to have a conversation about emotion leaves at his place of employment, but they agree to meet at Obliteration later that evening. Hatta also invites Lumina to join him that night, so that it's not just him gawking at the bartender, and Rhea invites Ward to come with. So then, cutting over to the undersling, to Vincent's house. Vincent lives in a brownstone in the undersling in a neighborhood called Gabriel's Courtyard. And Gabriel's Courtyard is one of the nicer parts of the undersling, in large part because it's heavily gang controlled. What's the full name of the organization? The Sarges is the short form of it, but the long name is pretty funny. Our Lady's Sergeants for Pre-War Preservation. So basically, it's a rough and tumble gang that, it's a rough and tumble gang that is very insistent on preserving historic architecture. And they make sure that things are largely orderly in that area. Gabriel is a reference to a historic figure who predates the war and became kind of a terrorist of sorts. And again, the name is kept, again, for historical reasons, even though it's very distasteful now. Vincent's been trying to summon this entity known only as Goliath for some time, and that's been his major project. And that has not been successful. He hasn't even been able to successfully call Goliath in, much less colloquy with him. So training Marweg has been kind of a welcome distraction. Marweg wants to learn how to summon dreams and dream entities, and they're kind of working up to that. They're basically doing all of the prereqs earlier. So they've been working with demons since that's Vincent's specialty. Marweg didn't really have much prior experience. Marweg breeds cherubs, but hasn't really done much with demons. And Vincent's very just, matter of fact. My reference picture for him is, I think it's Billy Porter, with that awesome, black dress that just looks super elegant. And Vincent is just like completely unfazed by the blustery demons, just matter of fact. Vincent's partner, Morgan, is this complete social butterfly who, runs the house, is very gregarious, and encourages them all to go out for a drink afterwards. And Vess, the maker ghost that is a tenant of theirs, Morgan and Vincent own the house. Vess stays behind, but Tosin, who's their other tenant, agrees to come with. And Tosin is a contractor, part of the union that's working on the constructions at Gatesmith. Vincent summons a demon to accompany them as just a simple guard, and this is standard practice for Vincent, where when I'm going out, I just have a demonic consort. Mara tries to summon a demon, but he's using a pretty standard journeyman pact, and the problem with some of those lower level pacts is that there's a finite number of entities to summon from those pacts, and so at peak summoning times, you sometimes don't actually get an entity at all, or in this case, you basically get like a miniature demon that arrives and says, "We regret to inform you that all pact eligible demons are currently busy. Requests will be responded to in the order received." And it's basically your ritual is important to us. I imagine them being like a pain or panic from the Disney Hercules type thing. So only Vincent is accompanied, but they all walk over and they end up getting a stall at Obliteration. So as a result, we end up with everybody showing up at Obliteration at various times here. Hatta and Lumina are sitting at the bar, and I came up with a couple drink names. I borrowed the Mind Eraser, No Chaser from the Them Crooked Vultures song. Some drinks have calorie counts and others have durations, which is basically like, here's how long the ride will be. And Hatta's trying to play it cool, but he is completely, innocent and wide-eyed. The bartender is, what's the guy's name? The guy with the fro and glasses from IT crowd. I think it's Richard something or other. Anyway, I've named him Spectacles because I borrowed the Tumblr thing of taking Greek pronunciations to words that don't have them. So instead of spectacles, it's Spectacles. And I'm sure I'll have someone named Saxophony at some point or other. But he's making drinks. They're getting started there. Rhea and Ward show up, and Rhea's completely flabbergasted to find Marweg there. Ward, who knows the rest of the people that Marweg's with because he's been to the house, he knows Vess, puts the 2 and 2 together. Marweg introduces everyone. Morgan offers some appetizers. Rhea takes one and has a bad trip. It basically lets you relive your day or somebody else's day. And she takes one and just experiences utter darkness. It's basically like an isolation tank experience. And Marweg notices her distress and gives her something else. Marweg is completely not attempting to blend. And this is a bit of like a rough and tumble dive bar of sorts. There's definitely a set of regulars. And the fact that Marweg's with Vincent and Morgan and Tosin, who do fit in, makes, he's kind of given a pass. No one gives him any trouble. But, they described it a little bit as like, going to a college party and one of your professors is there, just having the time of his life, dancing, whatever. So Tosin, they get talking to Tosin. Tosin's been frustrated because there's been issues with payments. There's been competition for labor. The union's in like this protracted battle with some of the organizations that are building these new structures in Gatesmith. And then on top of all of that, the Order of Goetics is building some buildings. And to get around some of the labor shortages, they've been summoning demonic labor. And then to pay for it, they've been letting the demons wreak havoc and sabotage other people's buildings. So there's been just a whole lot of tensions with that. In a scene here, a fight breaks out, and you see Aphis, the gaseous bartender, quickly weave through the crowd and envelop the 2 parties, and they just slump to the ground. A few regulars pick up the bodies and take them out, lay them on the sidewalk to kind of cool off. And Hatta's just sitting at the bar, drinking the equivalent of cheap rot gut emotion shots. He and Lumina order a few, shuffle them around, and are having fun experimenting with them. Spectacles has 5 or 6 arms. It's just kind of like, putting together these amazing, complicated drinks. You wouldn't really think this would be the crowd for fancy artisanal cocktails, but everyone's into it. It's clear that this is kind of a special evening. And Ward doesn't notice any ghosts, really. Like he normally picks up some cues, and is slowly kind of fading in and out. But as a result, like Marweg is trying to be a good host of sorts, and will sometimes be talking to empty air where he thinks Ward is, whether or not Ward's there. So here's where things go a little bit off the rails, where I don't know what inspired me to do this. I wanted there to be like 2 bar fights, where there was the first one that kind of set the stage for how the bouncer handled things, and then a second one that the PCs could actually potentially get involved in. But I didn't have it well planned, and I don't actually remember what my notes said for this because I deleted them. But I ended up having 2 Thaw walk in. And the Thaw in Invisible Sun, they're like these gold-skinned, white-haired, they have black boots and like a red jacket, and they have these stone horses that are their mounts. They're usually traveling in groups of 6 to 8, and they show up basically where there's a crime. They just kind of show up mysteriously, disappear mysteriously, and dispense justice. But they're not police, like they're not associated with any formal authority. No one quite knows what their deal is. And they only really show up at serious situations. So nobody So everybody's just pretty shocked because nobody's seen only two of them before. Nobody's seen them at this bar before. To be honest, nobody has seen them eat or drink before. So like to have two come in, sit down at the bar, order something to drink is weird to begin with. They sit down right next to Lumina and Hatta. And then shortly after all this, Tosin, it's his round. He goes up to the bar to get things for the table. And, Lumina always carries a little plushy octopus. And she's miming over her shoulder to kind of observe what's going on. She's stressed, and as a stress response, has a little flower growing out of her head. But they seem to be minding their business. Everyone settles down. And then when Tosin's up there, Lumina doesn't quite catch what goes on, but one of the Thaw ends up standing up menacingly. And Tosin stands his ground, doesn't back down, implying that like this is not your turf. And so then the other Thaw gets up, and everyone's kind of bracing for conflict. And in response to this, like Ward goes incorporeal. Lumina puts on her goggles and kind of shrinks in a little bit, and Morgan is one of the last to clue in. They were telling a story, but Vincent is watching the situation very carefully, isn't tensed, but is just kind of observant. And Marweg kind of takes his cue from Vincent. And Rhea weaves together a spell called Gossip's Breeze, which the aggregates for that are wind and freedom, I believe. And so I drew the empty gallows on the Grey Sun from the Soothe deck. And she learns that the undersling protects itself by having the streets reroute themselves intentionally sometimes to throw off law enforcement or outside forces. This was a defense that was developed during the war. So anyway, Aphis, the bouncer, comes up like in the previous fight. But the difference this time is that Tosin slumps, but the Thaw are completely unaffected. And they just look at each other and then wordlessly pick up Tosin by his arms and legs and take him outside. Marweg kind of turns to Vincent. It's like, should we do something about this? And Vincent's like, well, what would you have us do? And Marweg's like, maybe talk them down, have them let go of Tosin. And Vincent says, you've seen the difficulties I've had finding Goliath. Convincing the Thaw of anything is far harder. I don't know any Goetic who knows a mechanism to sway them. So absent the raw force to overpower them, we can only wait and just see. Now, there's a lot of ambiguity here. Like Marweg doesn't know if they're just taking Tosin to, sleep something off in the drunk tank, or if he's basically getting disappeared. No one's really seen the Thaw intervene in anything less than like a murder. So there's no point of reference. So he ends up walking out and kind of, pretending not to follow, but following the Thaw. They're going back the same way that Marweg came. So he's at least familiar with this section of the undersling. Rhea comes up to Hatta and asks about what happened. He and Lumina aren't sure. They're all just like, that was really weird. Hatta asks about the emotion leaves, but Rhea's like, let me go check on Marweg because she saw him leave. So she leaves to follow Marweg, and then Ward follows as well. While they're doing that, Hatta and Lumina end up meeting the bartender. He introduces himself as Spectacles. He's really affable, talking about the drinks and techniques. Turns out that he's just back from Gold and has brought back, some really interesting berries that, depending on when you pick them, they have different flavor profiles. And, he's basically doing a special night because the kinds of drinks that he's making and things that he's doing, you can't source the ingredients to do these on an ongoing basis, but you can do them as like a once in a while thing. So putting together like a night's worth of ingredients is fine. When he discusses with Hatta, Hatta mentions the idea of dabbling, and Spectacles offers to come by and visit. With Lumina, because she can shepherd minds, a lot of what she likes to do is enhance people's experiences. And so, the idea of sourcing these exquisite ingredients for her, it's like, well, the effect is what's important. And if I can get that effect by messing with your brain instead of like working hard on the ingredients, maybe that's an easier way to do it. As Marweg leaves, he sees the two from earlier, but the Thaw are still moving down the street. So he, starts walking down, talking to Ward. as Hatta and Lumina are talking, Aphis, the bouncer, comes over and was like, that was not supposed to happen. I don't know what's going on. I've never seen the Thaw show up here. I don't know why they weren't affected. Just, Aphis is clearly disturbed by the whole situation, which definitely unnerves Hatta and Lumina a little bit more. Meanwhile, Marweg, since he was distracted by Ward's arrival, turns back to find that he's actually lost the Thaw. So he stops to summon an entity known as Spindlereeve, which is kind of like a flying ribbon creature, and sends Spindlereeve to track them down. And Rhea catches up, and they all end up heading back to the club. So since they're back, Rhea and Hatta start talking. Emotion leaves. Hatta shares, some of what was learned with Aphis. Spectacles makes a special drink for Rhea that touches on her walks the path of suns thing, where as you turn the glass, the drink changes color, and whatever color it is when you drink it, it's giving you a different flavor. As they're talking, Rhea ends up mentioning the fact that she has these shards that she just got from Aesop, and Hatta's interested to try some. So she offers one to Hatta and kind of watches his reaction before taking one herself. And I pulled Enticing Jewel for the Red Sun. So when Hatta, puts the shard on a spoon, raises it to cheer, and puts it on his tongue, it dissolves rapidly. And Lumina kind of piggybacks on Hatta's mind to experience this thing sympathetically. And it's just like a complete euphoric experience, just triumphant, an amazing high. And Hatta recognizes that this is exactly the kind of high he wants to distill into a drink or something like that. So this definitely earned him a joy. So as a result, Rhea tries one as well. And so we got the Assassin on the Gold Sun, which was followed by Ghostly Presence on the Invisible Sun. So for her, her high ends up bringing up guilt about jumping the bureaucratic queue to get the deed for her current place of residence because of her influence through the Emotion Mills Consortium. But yeah, so Rhea doesn't know the pricing when they ask, so she says she'll follow up with Aesop on that. Hatta ends up walking Lumina back because it's en route. Lumina lives in the Hollows, which is a pretty rough neighborhood, but it's right next to the gateway to Fartown, and the neighborhood in Fartown that Hatta lives on is just on the other side of the gateway. So, they're walking over, and in the process, they actually see a whole bunch of 2x4s lumbering down the street and setting themselves up in the poor contractor's front yard. Meanwhile, Vincent is pretty unwilling to talk to Marweg about what all went down. Marweg assures him that it'll be okay and seems to want to talk about it some more, but Vincent is, very non-verbally just being like, I don't want to go there. So Marweg doesn't force it, and they kind of end the night on a bit of a downer note. In the meantime, Spindlereeve catches up, having lost the Thaw, but believes that they're heading towards the Marquee Quarter or Brick House or Strange Glass districts. And so yeah, that was our first session. We ended up with some really interesting directions to go with. I think the whole thing with where did the Thaw take Tosin is a really interesting angle to go. I think the question about what happens with the Pale Embassy, what's going on with that, is a great question. The fact that Tosin was implying that there was things going on in Gatesmith that were messy is interesting. And then there's the lower key question of what does Spectacles help Hatta with? And I think one of the big things as well is Lumina we haven't quite fully solidified her character arc yet. But one thing that was left over from the last season is that Rhea has a mission from Mara, the Warden of Blue, to find a forgotten memory and return it to its owner. And Lumina has Iconoclastic, but we don't know what it's aimed at yet as her foundation, and also was looking at the Vengeance or the Avenge character arc. But we didn't quite know, like, what are you avenging? What's the trigger? And so I think what we'll do is we'll have Rhea find the forgotten memory and have that memory be Lumina's, and have that returned memory be the triggering event for, I want vengeance on this thing. I want to burn this organization down, whatever that is, which will also, potentially take, her shepherd's mind's forte from, I just want people's tea to taste better, to maybe I want to utilize this to its potential, in seeking my aims. So anyway, that was our first session. Our next session is on the 14th or so. So I'll do a follow-up to this at some point after that. Thank you.